We have the two authors with us, Dennis Wamsted and Seth Feaster. Dennis and Seth's work focuses on the U.S. power sector, markets, utilities, and the energy transition. Dennis will give the PowerPoint presentation, which should take around 20 minutes. Dennis and Seth will answer your questions. Please type your questions into the Q&A box, which you should see at the bottom or top of your screen. Today's session is being recorded, and all registrants will receive a follow-up email with links to the PowerPoint and the report. And I'm going to introduce them quickly. The presenters: Dennis Wamsted is an IEEFA analyst and editor who has covered energy and environmental policy and technology issues for 30 years. He's the former editor of the Energy Daily, a Washington, D.C. based newsletter, and is a graduate of Harvard University. Seth Feaster is an energy data analyst who has followed the coal industry and the U.S. power sector for 5 years with IEEFA. Prior to that, he had 25 years of experience creating visual presentations at the New York Times with a focus on complex financial and energy data. He also worked at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and lives in New York. So Dennis will give the presentation, and both Dennis and Seth will take your questions when he's done. So without further ado, Dennis, please begin.
Thank you very much, Vivian. It's a pleasure to be here with you all this afternoon. I hope we do have plenty of time for questions at the end of the presentation. This is our 2022 U.S. Power Sector Outlook webinar. And we are focusing on themes throughout the report and the presentation today. We have a number of themes that we outlined in the Outlook. If you didn't have a chance to read it, it's a pretty good read, pretty short read. I would encourage you to download it from our website. I think you'd probably enjoy it. But the themes overall, as we started this Outlook early in the year, prices were already starting to rise on the gas side and the coal side. And then, of course, we had the unfortunate Russian invasion of Ukraine, which has turned energy markets around the world upside down. We do not, however, believe that that unfortunate event has changed in any significant degree the long-term trends that we see here in the U.S. Regarding the transition away from fossil fuels and toward renewable energy and battery storage. And throughout the presentation, we will be going down this list that you can see here, providing a little detail on each of these issues: the acceleration of the coal phase out in the U.S., the peaking of gas generation for electricity in the U.S., or what we see as the peak, the absolute surge in wind, solar, and storage generation proposals across the U.S., the real-time, real-world development of offshore wind in the U.S. This is a big development that is going to have major impacts in the next few years on East Coast power markets, and hopefully by the end of the decade, even in the Pacific as well. Then we also touch on the very, very fast growth in battery storage, both over the past 5 years when it's hit the ground running, if you will, and then the coming 5 years where we're going to see just a huge, pardon the pun, explosion, maybe that's the wrong word, but in battery storage generation or capacity installations. And then we talk about a couple of issues that we need to look at going forward that are going to have an impact on the power markets here in the U.S. That would be the surge in EV production and purchases here in the U.S. and the development of the hydrogen market. So this chart shows a couple things. One, obviously, that there's a long way to go. The transition has just started. We will own up to that, but we do believe that the takeoff is right now. We are approaching the takeoff. Fossil fuels have declined over the past 10 years from about 70% of the market in the US to a little less than 60%. At the same time, the rise in renewables has pushed renewables up to 20% of the market. We are pretty confident that by 2025, 2026, renewables will top 30% of the market in the United States, given current trends in installation and proposed projects. We also this year highlighted in the outlook a development that we think has major implications for the transition in the US. We believe that electricity generation from natural gas has peaked in the US. The high total we see occurred in 2020 when prices were really, really low in the gas market. And obviously that was the onset of pandemic. So there was a drop in electricity generation overall in the US. There was a huge drop in coal generation. And on the flip side of that, gas generation continued its climb from the past 10 years and rose to about 1.4 billion megawatt hours for the year. It declined last year a little bit in 2021. We expect it to continue to decline in this year in 22 and 23. And you can see here on the slide, these are the projections from the Energy and Information Administration showing their outlook for the next couple of years, having gas generation fall as well. Some of this is price driven. Gas prices are obviously high. But a lot of this also is the influx of renewable generation that's coming into markets across the US and pushing more expensive fossil generation out of the generation stack. There has been an ongoing, and as those of you who follow IEEFA know, for the past 10 years, we have charted the decline in the coal generation market in the US. We believe that in the past couple of years, there's been an acceleration in acceptance throughout the utility market here in the US as to the necessity and actually the economic rationale for getting rid of coal generation in the US. It's turned a corner. And this year, the past 18 months, we've seen announcements from Georgia Power, TVA, and Duke, all three very large coal-fired utilities in the past, basically saying they're going to be out of coal entirely by 2035 and perhaps sooner. We highlight here an interesting quote from Jeffrey Grubb, who's Director of Resource Planning at Georgia Power. He was testifying last week, I believe, before the Georgia Public Service Commission on the Georgia Power's current IRP before the commission. And he flat out said, it's no longer economic to operate the coal plants that are owned by Georgia Power. And looking forward, obviously, they don't have a lot of positive information for the coal fleet. They have announced essentially the closure of all of their coal plants by 2028, with the possibility that they'll keep 2 of them online into the early 2030s. It's entirely possible that those will be retired earlier as well, given build out of renewables and the addition of battery storage throughout their service territory. But there's clearly been a transition in the utility industry. And that transition can be seen here in this graphic, where we chart by year announced retirements from coal operators around the country. And on the left in the dark blue, you can see, the peaks and valleys of retirements in the 2010s, with a very large amount of retirements in 2015 when the mercury rule that EPA published took effect. This year, we're going to see a fairly large increase from 2021. You'll also be able to see the largest number out there is in 2028, which is when the next very significant EPA rule takes final effect, their rule on coal ash and effluent emissions or releases from coal plants. And that has forced, in the past couple of years, a significant number of decisions in the utility sector on what to retire and what to retrofit. And what has happened is many of these utilities have said it's not economically viable to put additional environmental controls on these coal plants, and we're going to retire them, which is why this number is so high. It would be, a record-shattering 22,000 megawatts retired in 2028. But basically, everything you see here between now and 2030 is baked into the system. These are retirements that we believe, from company announcements, filings with public service commissions, and other data at EIA, these retirements are going to happen. And essentially it adds up to almost 100,000 megawatts, which is almost 50% of the existing coal-fired generation in the US. It's a very, very large number. And we think it will continue to grow in the next couple of years. I would point out one of the new rules that hasn't taken effect yet from the EPA is on cross-state air pollution. They're cracking down or making that rule a little stricter going forward, which will require a number of coal plants to install selective catalytic reduction equipment to control NOx emissions. And EPA, in publishing the proposal, said that they expected that perhaps another 18,000 megawatts of coal capacity would be retired as a result of that rule. So this number is large, getting larger, and we expect many more announcements in the years ahead. This is a different way of looking at the same information, but it gives you a very good sense of the transition in the coal sector in the US overall. When coal generation peaked in the US in 2011, there was 317 gigawatts of coal generation around the country. During the decade of the 2010s, essentially 100 gigawatts, 100,000 megawatts retired. Already now, we expect another 100,000 megawatts to retire by 2030. And as I said, we expect that number to increase, which would leave not very much going forward. So you can see that the transition here is well underway and accelerating. We expect further acceleration as the years continue here in the early 2020s. The interesting way of looking at this transition can be seen in the next couple of graphics that I must say, just as a background, that Seth Feaster, our graphic guru, oh, he didn't want me to say that, drew up. These are fascinating ways of looking at the transition in the US power sector. This is a chart for ongoing chart, but 3.5 years and moving forward of coal's market share in the US. And at the top, you can see the breakdown between 10 and 15% up to 30 and 35%. And you can see the transition downward. Just 3 years ago, coal was above 20%, close to every day of the year. That is clearly not going to happen in 2022. There's also been a significant increase just in the first couple of months of this year in the number of days when coal's market share was only between 15 and 20%. You can get the picture contrasts here, which are very, very interesting. You look at 2019, there's essentially no or very few days when it's in the 15 to 20% range. And now in 2022, that's becoming a predominant color in the season we're in now, March and April. At the same time, you have the decline in coal, you have the increase in market share in renewables. There are two things that I think are particularly interesting in this graphic. You can see in 2019, before the recent wave of solar and wind construction took place, a very large number of green spaces when renewables, and this would include hydro as well, but when renewables were between 10 and 15% of the market. A not insignificant amount, but not up there battling with coal or gas even. So far in 2022, there's only been one day when renewables market share was less than 15%. And what I think you can see very clearly from the past couple of months, March and April here, is a significant increase into the 25 to 30% range. And there's already been, I think, 4 days, Seth can correct me, but I think there's 4 days this year when it's been above 30% of the market, which is just a phenomenal increase in 3 years. But what's important to know about this phenomenal increase over the past 3 years is that it's going to continue into the next 3, 4, and 5 years. This is a graphic we pulled together looking at the construction or capacity that will be added in the US grids over the next 3 years. And there are a couple of takeaways here. One of the most important is that 75% of all the new generation that is expected to come online in the next 3 years is going to be renewables, solar, wind, or batteries. That leaves very little for the rest of the market. Most of this planned generation in the orange up here at the top is natural gas, and then we have the tiny sliver in the next couple of years for nuclear power at the Vogtle plant in Georgia. There are a couple other very interesting things in this graphic that are worth noticing. One in particular is in 2024. You can see that for the first time, we expect offshore wind to enter the market and be, start to change the market, but also just be counted in future generation. This will be the first time we have generation from large offshore wind in the U.S., but this won't be the last time. And going forward, we'll see an expansion of this offshore wind category here. The other thing to point out is that this chart is drawn from filings at EIA, and they don't go back and look necessarily when companies have decided that, we're not going to build that. And as far as I can tell, in my years of covering the industry, I don't think companies actually have to tell EIA. So we know for a fact that there are at least 2, probably 3 natural gas planned natural gas plants in this construction 23, 24 that actually have been canceled. So these percentages include plants for natural gas that aren't actually going to be built, which would change obviously the overall percentages for the renewable sector, to the renewables benefit. Worth remembering that this probably overstates the gas that will be built and understates the amount of solar, wind, and batteries that will be built. One of the reasons we're so enthusiastic about the transition that we see happening is, you can see on this chart, with the very, very large number of very active, very real offshore wind projects that are under development along essentially the entire Atlantic coast. And one of the big pieces of news in the past 6 months is that 2 of these projects are now actually under construction. The US has lagged way behind Europe in building offshore wind, but we see a potential in the next 8 years before 2030 for a build out of 19,000 to 25,000 megawatts of wind. This chart here shows 19,000 megawatts that already have leases and are going through the permitting process, 2 that are under construction, but it doesn't show the entire gamut of projects that are either state goals. New Jersey and New York have very, very significant statewide goals for offshore wind, and other projects that have been talked about by developers that may come to fruition in the next 10 years. But these are what we would call real projects, and they are going to come online, almost all of them by 2030. And as they do, they're going to have a very large impact on the Eastern power markets. All of the power proposals up here by Massachusetts and Rhode Island and Connecticut are in the ISO New England service territory. There is no coal in the ISO, well, there's one coal plant, but essentially no coal in New England. So when those come online, they're going to be starting to push gas out of the generation stack in the New England region. The same is true for projects that are built in the New York region here off of Long Island. There's no coal in New York anymore. When those come online, they're going to be pushing gas out of the market. So if you'll think back to one of our earlier graphics where we showed what we believe is the peak in gas generation in the US, this is one of the reasons for this influx of new large offshore wind. These are just a little breakdown of the wind that is going to be arriving very soon. The reason we charted this one out is because these actually have construction completion dates attached to the projects. Two of the South Fork Wind and Vineyard Wind projects are both already under construction, and others are going to be getting underway shortly. This is a big development in the U.S. power sector, and is going to really have an impact going forward. Another area that's going to have a big impact going forward is battery storage. This, we decided to look backward when we looked at the development of the battery storage market, and you can see just the huge run up in construction and installations in the past 5 years. We've gone from essentially no battery storage, 250 megawatts, to this year installation of more than 3,500 megawatts. And also there's been a pretty noticeable increase in the megawatt hours of that storage. It used to be a little over 1 hour per megawatt, and now the storage length, the duration has gotten longer, and now it's a little over 3 hours, or verging on 3 hours. We expect that trend to continue as well. Looking forward, we decided not to chart this out because some of these projects on an annual basis, some of the projects, there is some delay, and as we all know, in the supply side, it's trouble getting things, pretty much anything these days. But it's hard to chart things out on an annual basis. But the folks at the Energy Storage Association at Wood Mackenzie did their latest year-end wrap-up for 2021, looking into 2022, and they are projecting essentially an average of 8,000 megawatts of utility scale storage that will be installed over the next 5 years, 40,000 megawatts overall. It's just an enormously high number that's going to have major impacts on the system and allow the integration of these significant amounts of new renewables and storage. You're going to be able to build a solar project, and when it's not needed during the peak of the day, when demand is, perhaps a little bit lower, you can charge up your battery, and then between 6 and 10 p.m. at night, you can discharge your battery back into the market. It's going to help the market be more reliable. It's going to help keep prices down, and it's going to allow a lot more green energy into the system. This is just another way of looking at the same data going forward. It's the development and the size of the market where you're getting up over to $8 billion a year. So a pretty sizable increase from where we are today. So going forward, as I've stressed here, we really think offshore wind is a big, big area of development and of impact on the U.S. power markets. It's interesting that just in the past few months, there have been a number of proposals where you wouldn't expect them necessarily. The folks in Louisiana have begun studying offshore wind in the Gulf of Mexico and actually have a statewide goal for 2035, maybe, I forget. But there was an unsolicited application filed off the coast of Washington the other day. That would be the state of Washington, for a 2,000 megawatt facility, which would be a floating wind facility, which is another area of potential growth going forward, definitely further out. But these markets are now starting to exist, and people are saying, you know what, I can tap into that. And there's also going to be a lease in California by the federal government later this spring for offshore wind development in the central coast of California going forward. So this is going to be an area definitely to pay attention to, and to see the impact on the power sector overall. We also see that electric vehicles are going to have a big impact on the power sector. They have started to take off in the U.S. I think now they're hindered more by supply issues than lack of market demand. The market demand's there, and there is going to be a big uptick in the next few months when they start selling that Ford F-150. I think that's going to broaden the reach of electric vehicles in the U.S., and it's going to show that electric vehicles can also be used to help the grid going forward. We also think another development to watch is the increase in duration for energy storage. one of the knocks on it has always been that it's only available for an hour or two or maybe 4. There have been some very interesting developments in California this year with contracts signed for 8-hour lithium ion battery storage, which is a big step forward for lithium ion. But there's also been a large number of new developments with other chemistries and or with other technologies promising energy storage going forward. It's a little, I will admit, perhaps easy to say, but I would posit to you that because there was never a market before for long duration storage, nobody developed it. Now that there is a market for that kind of long duration, there will be folks who can find a solution. I think that will develop. We just have to give it a little time. And obviously the development of hydrogen, we have tracked hydrogen closely at IEEFA, especially the disagreements between those folks who want to develop blue hydrogen and those who want to develop green hydrogen. But either color, we certainly prefer green. Either color is going to have an impact on the market going forward. This is a quickie little look at the development of EV sales in the US. You can see that last year was a very, very good year for electric vehicles. And this year is promising to be equally good, with some outside analysts expecting that it could double again. That may or may not happen depending on supply issues, but the growth trend is sharply upward. And with that, I will wrap up our little presentation here. We would be happy to take all your questions. The Outlook itself can be found at this link here, and I believe in the chat box, we are going to have a link to the presentation slides, which I encourage you to copy and download. And with that, I will say welcome to Seth and see if Vivian has any questions for us. We would look forward to talking with you.